So before we talk about the current crisis in Yemen with the Red Sea and the Houthis and global shipping, let's just take a step back and think about how many ongoing crises there are that haven't been resolved and show no sign of being resolved in the foreseeable future. Because there's a lot of them. And it kind of makes me a bit nostalgic for Vietnam and even for the Afghan War. Because even those were disasters that stretched on for decades, they at least had the decency to end at some point. Sure, it was a massive L for the US, but at least they could put a bookend on it and never mention it again. They're doing that with the current crises, but unfortunately, they aren't getting resolved before they put a bookmark on it, memory hold it, and never mention it again. So let's just go through a couple of the ones that are like three or four current things ago that are still ongoing messes that were never really resolved. We have Libya. Does anyone remember Libya? I had to dig deep in my memory to recall this. There's the Libyan civil war, and Obama thought it was a good idea to get the U.S. involved, and it turned into a disaster. And then the refugee crisis happened because Gaddafi wasn't blocking them anymore. And then there was another civil war, and then another civil war. And I've actually spent some time sitting down and trying to figure out the political conflict in Libya, and I can admit I can't. I don't know if anybody understands it. So that never got resolved. That's an ongoing disaster. That's been memory hold. We're just not going to talk about that again. There was the first Yemen crisis that went on for decades, wherein the Houthis were fighting the Saudis and the UAE and a couple other countries, and the U.S. was involved with that. That never got resolved. That was a disaster. China actually kind of wrapped that up with the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but that never really got resolved, and that's grown into the current thing. We had the whole Taiwan Strait crisis, which had actually been kind of tensions had kind of been going down, but then we had the I can't believe it's not a color revolution sunflower student movement that overthrew the KMT and brought the Democratic People's Party to power and immediately started to antagonize mainland China. And now that situation keeps going from bad to worse. Of course, there's a southern border, but we can't talk about that. That just kind of gets periodically worse every couple of decades, or rather, every couple of years. I don't think the Iraq War ever really got resolved. So I remember hearing the other day the Iraqi government was asking the U.S. once again to pull the remaining troops out of Iraq. They still have troops there. It's still a mess. We had Iran fire that missile at the U.S. or Mossad or whatever it was based in Iraq. They're still occupying parts of Syria. Anyone remember the Syrian civil war? Anyone remember ISIS? And, well, I guess the Israeli government's talking about ISIS now and saying that Hamas is part of ISIS for somehow. Somehow that makes sense. Yeah, the U.S. is still occupying like the oil fields in Syria. That was never resolved. I guess the Egypt thing got resolved when the super Muslim bros were overthrown by the current regime, and now Egypt's like a pseudo military dictatorship, and I guess that was resolved. I'm not sure how involved the U.S. was with the current phase of the civil war in Sudan between the rapid support forces and the Sudanese military. Of course, last but not least, we have the Ukrainian quagmire and the ongoing Israeli quagmire, which leads us into this. So, as you may or may not have known, what happened last year was Hamas launched a large scale attack on Israel, October 8th, I believe it was. They killed approximately 600 to 700 people. The Israeli government will claim basically they're all civilians. I'm sure a lot of them were military. They took a bunch of people hostage. And the Netanyahu government just went completely balls to the wall and just started leveling everything. And we have all this other insane stuff coming out, like we're going to deport them all to like the Congo, and just the rhetoric that you're getting about like basically exterminating the Palestinian people. And so this environment is a bit different than how it was the last couple of times. Because Saudi Arabia and Iran came to something of an understanding that they were going to be like the two big Muslim powers, they were going to have spheres of influence, they were at least going to sit down, have regular relations, and talk to each other. So we don't have that aspect to this conflict that we previously had. Saudi Arabia and Iran are both able to kind of stand together, even if at arm's length, in favor of Muslim unity against Israel. And so the situation we currently have is Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran are all more or less united, even if they aren't really allied with each other, against what's going on with it in Israel. And the Houthis are a rebel group, or rather, it depends how you want to describe it. Yemen is a disaster. It's been a disaster for decades. I don't know what's a rebel group and what's a government group and who's recognized and not recognized. But they were a Shia group who controls, I think, about half of Yemen. The rest of Yemen is controlled by either Sunnis or Al Qaeda, or is occupied by various other Arab states. The whole thing is basically just kind of a mess. But the Saudi Arabians and a couple other Arab states had invaded Yemen, I think it was like 20 years ago or something like that, to try to overthrow the Houthis after they seized power. Now, they've been fighting them and they haven't been able to defeat them. And the Houthis have proved to be some of the toughest, most resilient people in the world. They're able to fight off Saudi Arabia. And keep in mind, Saudi Arabia, I'm sure they're extremely incompetent, but they can afford the best military equipment money can buy. It's kind of like a case with Singapore, South Korea, or Japan. I guess like they can afford like the best equipment, and they still just got completely blown out by the Houthis. And it was just a massive quagmire. It was a disaster. And that was just going on. I think the crisis has settled down a bit because Iran and Saudi Arabia are talking, and the Houthis are allied to Iran because they're a Shia group. Now, because of this geopolitical shift, the Houthis decided to get in on the action. And the Houthis have said, you know what? We're in a really strategically important place. Yemen just borders the Red Sea. It borders the Suez Canal. Let's just start firing rockets at ships passing through it. Although they've said that Russian and Chinese ships could go through fine, they aren't going to fire on them. That's okay. As long as neither of those countries support Israel and Gaza, that's good. But basically, Israel, the United States, and any country that supports Israel, they're just firing rockets at. I don't know how many they've actually hit, but most people don't really want to go through waters and have missiles shot at them and possibly have their ships boarded. So a lot of ships have been started going around the Cape of Good Hope, and that's just kind of been a mess because, well, it's certainly possible to do so. It's longer, it costs more in terms of fuel. It's just broadly speaking disruptive. You have to change all the delivery timelines, you have to change all the routes. It's a mess. So we will get into these articles. The US showed up with the B Team coalition. We talked about this. The B Team coalition of like the US, Britain, and then they got like five or six other countries. It was like Comoros, Denmark, Norway, Canada, Holland, who he sent like five dudes so that we could pretend it's a coalition. And they've just been firing rockets into Yemen, and it hasn't done shit. And the Houthis are just going to keep doing it. And what is the U.S. supposed to do about this? And I guess we'll get into that in a second. But how are they going to deal with the Houthis? I mean, if the Saudis couldn't deal with them, how the hell is the U.S. going to deal with them? The U.S., are they going to invade and occupy Yemen? I mean, the Saudis fired missiles and rockets and all the kind of stuff the U.S. had. A lot of the stuff they directly bought from the U.S. for decades. And they were less concerned about optics than the U.S. will be. And literally, it did not achieve anything. So how is the U.S. going to resolve this? I don't really see any way they can resolve this. The only way that this can be resolved is if the situation in Israel gets resolved. And Netanyahu has said that, oh, it's going to continue on to 2025. So there is no resolution. Either the U.S. drops Israel or stops supporting them, or Netanyahu gets overthrown or something like that, or this whole Yemen thing is going to continue for at least another year. Now, this may or may not be the case. Bebe may just be bluffing or being kind of hyperbolic, but let's say that's the case. So we're going to have U.S. shipping potentially blocked for at least another year. And a bunch of other countries in Europe who are currently having uh, recessions or financial crises. Of course, the alternative is the U.S. could just tell Israel to stop what they are doing, but I don't think they'll do that. And this is the question we've often asked ourselves: how much of a yandere is the U.S. for Israel? Like, is there a limit to how what can happen in terms of international diplomacy, in terms of world standing, that would make them not support Israel? I haven't read the books, but I was told by someone who read the Northwest Front books that when the Northwest Republic was breaking away, the U.S. Army was initially fighting to stop them from seceding, but Israel got attacked by Palestine. So they immediately dropped everything, let like the upper fifth of the country secede to go save Israel because that was really the only thing that they cared about. So if they're not going to ever drop Israel, this thing's going to continue for another year. I don't see how they're going to resolve this militarily. And even if this current thing does resolve, Netanyahu says there's no two-state solution. He's basically said they're going to occupy Gaza indefinitely. And I don't know if the Houthis are going to take a low-intensity operation as enough for them to stop firing the rockets. So let's see what The Economist says. Tracking ships in the Red Sea. Since its opening, okay, the Suez Canal, 10% of the world's seaborne trade by volume goes through the Suez Canal. I would have thought it would be more, but I guess maybe not. Their attacks have widened the scope of the Middle East. So this is a week period in 2023 versus 2024. Traffic has fallen by half. This is the number of containers that are going through the Red Sea in the current year. As you can see, it is cratered. A bunch of them have just completely stopped. Current volume of cargo is 66% lower than expected. It's from like 600,000 down to 200,000 containers, and the Cape of Good Hope has seen like more than a threefold increase in the number of people going down that. It adds an extra 10 days at least. That's a lot of additional fuel. That's a lot of additional other stuff. Oh, and we're talking about the carbon footprint because that's priority number one at the moment. We're also going to see shipping costs are going to go way up. Rose 146%. So prior to this, it was what, like 500,000 or whatever. It's like 5,000, and now it's like 3,000. So 30,000. So it's my math is complete shit here. It's gone up a lot. We'll just say that. So how are they going to deal with this? Like Biden says, Biden concedes Houthis haven't been deterred from carrying out attacks as U.S. continues to launch airstrikes. President Biden conceded Thursday that the strikes against Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen are not deterring the group's attacks in the Red Sea. So, like, what are they going to do? Are we going to? When you say, would you say, are they stopping the Houthis? No. Are we going to continue? Yes. Why? Like, it's we're not going to be able to do that. Now the U.S. can deploy ships to shoot down the Houthi missiles, but like the Houthi missiles are cheap. Like they're only a couple $1,000, and the U.S. is having to use like $1 million and multi-million-dollar interceptors to shoot these things down. And the Houthis don't even really need to sink any ships. They just have to make it unpleasant enough that the container ships don't go through there. The Houthis have used one day later radar sighting unilateral operation, uh, and even the facilities they blow up. I'm sure most of them are pretty hardened against any kind of air attack, and I'm sure they've distributed their equipment because they put up with Saudi Arabia. Okay, so it wasn't quite as long as I thought it was. So it was about 8 years or something that went on. I'm seeing if it has the force totals somewhere in here, like how many aircraft the Saudis had. But I mean, the Saudis have a pretty big air force. Let me just bring that up and we'll take a look at it. Oh, okay, there we go. It says here. Yeah, so the Saudis had 100 fighters. The Houthis, I don't think, have an air force at all. All these other Arab states sent in additional stuff. Uh, the Saudis, like, did their best, and the Houthis still control. I think it's actually more than half of Yemen because I think the eastern half of Yemen is basically desert. Um, so they weren't able to really achieve anything. And let me see what kind of casualties did they take. Not a huge amount of casualties. I'm sure it was actually much higher than that. Okay, here we go. So they use Eurofighter Typhoons. I think those are fairly good. They use F-15s. I'm not sure how good the F-15 is. They look like they're fairly modern aircraft, though. To be honest, so they do have like a modern air force. I'm not. It's very hard to tell. I'm gonna admit because aircraft are fairly easy to upgrade, and so are tanks. So it can be very difficult to tell how modern something is. Because like a tank chassis, you can just remove the stuff inside of it, stick in a new engine, stick in new electronics. Same thing for this. I'm not sure how good these are. They're probably not nearly as good as like F-22s or F-35s, but it's still a fairly modern aircraft. I'm trying to see what else do we have here. War in Yemen. Let me see what kind of tanks does the Saudi army have. Okay, they have attack helicopters. I'm just trying to see where their tanks are. I think they use Abrams. Yeah, they use Abrams and Pattons. So they have like hundreds of Abrams. Keep in mind they have more tanks than like they have about the same number of main battle tanks as France, UK, and Germany combined. So yeah, that's where we're at the moment. The Saudis couldn't do it, so how is the U.S. going to do it? And they're going to have to do it amphibiously, or they're going to have to operate out of Saudi Arabia, and they're going to have to blow through because this wasn't even an expected crisis. This isn't even Russia or China. This is yet another one. They're going to have to blow through a whole bunch of weapons that they don't have to try to resolve, and it's just not going to go anywhere. So it's got to be one of the fastest quagmires in history. I honestly don't know, unless they can get Iran to call them off. But I don't know if they actually are even. I don't know if they even Iran controls them. I mean, the Houthis are a pretty tough group. I'm sure Iran has some influence over them, but I hardly think they're a puppet of Iran. So what if Iran tells them to stop and they tell Iran to fuck off? Where are we left then? It's just it's a mess. It's a total mess. There's no resolution in sight, and it just looks like it's going to continue on as is for the foreseeable future. So that's where we are. I don't see any resolution to this crisis. Basically, just Russia and China will be able to continue to use it, the Red Sea, and laugh at the U.S., and the U.S. will continue to just support Israel regardless of what happens. So that's cool. Anyways, that's all I had to say. God bless, and I'll talk to you later.